Hi everyone, thanks for joining in. We're very excited to have you here. We're just going to give it a few minutes before we get started, just so we can give everyone a chance to log in. So just bear with us for a few more minutes and we'll get going. Can see some familiar names there, so that's really great. It's really good to see you guys again. All right, so we might get started. We'll just let the latecomers come in there in pace. Yeah, so I'm here today with Dr. Simon Clulo. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You absolutely nailed it.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so here with Dr. Simon Clulo, really amazing presentation coming up. It's going to be visually stunning, so really looking forward to it. Actually, the manager of the Environment and Sustainability team, Jacob, was supposed to be coming in and doing an introduction for us. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it today, so I'm just going to do an introduction of Simon on his behalf. So Simon comes from a family of biologists, and both he and his father came out of the Frog Lab at University of Newcastle, where they worked with Professor Mike Mauney. Many top herpetologists came through the Frog Lab, and Simon has led and been involved with many exciting projects and discoveries. Simon experienced many ecologists' dream and discovered a new species of frog near Newcastle Airport in 2016. And he has worked tirelessly for conservation and has some of the best stories of any field ecologist I have ever met. So that's just a bit of a glowing introduction of Simon here on Jacob's behalf. So we're very excited to have him here with us today. I'll just go over some quick Zoom housekeeping before we get going. So if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please just pop them in the Q&A box and we'll get those answered towards the end. And if you have any general sort of questions, just pop them in the chat box and I'll get to them. If you have any technical issues or questions about Zoom in general, just pop them in the chat box and I will get to them. So yeah, I'll pass over to Simon.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's fantastic to have been invited to talk tonight, and it was actually a whole heap of fun preparing this talk because it allowed me to go back in time a little bit and find some very old and slightly embarrassing photographs of myself and a couple of other people I know. Today's focus really, it's great because I've got a lot of freedom to just go back and actually talk a little bit about the story behind how the book that myself and Mike Swan wrote on Australia's frogs came to be. And in doing so, really take a journey through some of Australia's fantastic frogs. Some things I've learnt about them and things that have inspired me and hopefully will inspire you also. So all of the photographs today or nearly all of them are not mine. One or two it might be, but they're from a whole bunch of fantastic photographers that contributed to the book, and there'll be acknowledgements for them at the end. So basically along those lines, let's see if we can change the slide here. So for a lot of people, when they think frogs, they think of a couple of particular types of frogs. They think about these small green frogs or small brown frogs that most people encounter, especially around Ku-ring-gai, Central Coast, Newcastle, area where many people today will be from. And I can tell you now that I get contacted a lot about species IDs, and the vast majority of them come down to a couple of species that are commonly encountered in Sydney and the Central Coast. And here are two classic examples: the emerald spotted tree frog up there in the top left, a classic sort of brownish coloured tree frog that sometimes jumps up in the people's windows and gets in the backyard ponds, and the eastern dwarf green tree frog, Latoria phalanx, down there in the right. Or occasionally, perhaps this little fella here, the striped marsh frog, Limna dynastes peroni, that sounds, this one you might not have seen so much, but perhaps people are familiar with their call. It sounds a little bit like a tennis ball being hit, and some people find them quite annoying because they get into backyard ponds and keep people awake at night. And for a lot of people, when they think about Australian frogs, these are the sorts of images they get in their mind, because this is what most people are familiar with, just a small number of species that are commonly encountered in more urban areas. But Australia's frogs are just so much more than this, and so incredibly exciting. And I really want to take us down this path of just how incredible Australia's frogs can be. And I'm going to start today on that journey by actually relaying a story that was told to me by Professor Mike Marnie, who would go on to become my PhD supervisor, funnily enough, and something that really inspired and stuck with me, and I think is just a classic example of how amazing Australia's frogs are. And this story starts here in a stream in the Conondale Ranges back in about the 1970s, I think about 1972, time before I was born, believe it or not. There was a young frog biologist who was doing his PhD at the time by the name of David Liem. Now, it was unusual back then in the 1970s that anybody bothered studying frogs. Not many people were doing their PhD in frogs. Not many people cared. People cared more about things like mammals and birds. But he was doing a PhD on frogs up there and the Conondale Ranges in Queensland. And one day he came across this particular frog. Now, this got him really excited, because this frog, he knew straight away, was actually an undescribed species, not known to science before. And he knew that because it was a very aquatic frog. So unlike most frogs in Australia that spend time in the terrestrial environment and out on reeds, this one spent its time in the water and swimming around. So there are frogs in Africa, like the African clawed frog, that do that, but not many Australian species. So straight away he thought, wow, this is a new species. I'm very excited. Now, like I said, back in the 1970s, not a lot of people studied frogs, but there was one professor down at the University of Adelaide by the name of Mike Tyler, who studied frogs at the time and was really interested to hear about this finding. So he thought, oh, wow, I really would love to see one of these. So he got on the phone to David and said, oh, I've heard about your discovery. Do you mind sending me one of these frogs? And David said, oh, sure, no problem. I'll send you one. So he put it in an esky, bunged it on a plane, as you did back in the 1970s, and sent it on its way to Adelaide. Mike Tyler received this esky, opened it up, and had a look inside, and there were two of these frogs. And he thought, oh, fantastic, it's wonderful to see, but I'm not sure what David has done. I really only asked for one. I really needed one. It was a bit strange, but he thought, never mind, PhD students and math doesn't always line up, but I'll get on the phone and I'll thank him. So he did. He said, oh, thanks very much, but really you only needed to send one of these frogs. And David said, well, that's funny. I did only send one. And Mike Tyler thought, oh, this is, again, a bit strange, but didn't think much of it. Thought, again, PhD students and math. But he went back anyway to get his bag of the two frogs and looked inside, and there happened to be three frogs. And at this point, Mike thought, maybe it's not just a problem with David and his math, but something strange is going on. And as he watched, he saw something that looked a little bit like this. A fourth frog, small frog, coming out of the mouth of a larger frog in the bag. And it turned out that, so Mike got very excited by this and realized something quite incredible was happening. X-rayed the animal, had a look inside, like what scientists used to do, and actually found a whole bunch more little frogs inside this frog. And it turned out that it wasn't just any species discovery. What they'd actually discovered was the gastric brooding frog. This is a frog that is like no other known on Earth. It was actually able to convert its stomach into a makeshift worm, by switching off all the gastric secretions, stopping the contractions, and effectively gestating the embryos or the tadpoles inside its stomach and eventually giving birth out of its mouth. Now, no frog anywhere on Earth has ever been known to give birth before, let alone any animal anywhere on Earth being known to convert its stomach into a womb and give birth out of its mouth. This was such an incredible discovery at the time that purportedly it was written up for the world's leading scientific journal called Nature, and was actually rejected because they said this has to be a hoax. There is no way this can be true. And that's only ever happened once before with the journal Nature, when the platypus was first discovered and described. They also thought another hoax out of Australia. But hopefully this just goes to show what we have in our backyard, being the continent of Australia and the incredible frog diversity. Sorry, and that's its name there, the gastric brooding frog, Rheobatrachus silus. And it was about this time, well, it was before this time I had an interest in frogs, but by this time and learning about these sorts of things, I just got beyond fascinated. I was a very young frog, up-and-coming frog enthusiast, I think you'd call me. I wasn't even a professional biologist back then, who just got captivated by this. And so this here is a picture of my former PhD supervisor, Mike Marnie, who I worked on frogs at the time that I was learning about all this, and he's the one that taught me much of what I know today. And I really just started to get involved in any way, shape or form I could. I was very fortunate that as a very young undergraduate student, he actually let me in his lab and gave me the junk desk and allowed me to begin my frog journey on a more formal capacity. So here are some of these embarrassing old photographs I told you might pop up. And this, I think you can tell by some of the attire we're wearing here how long ago it was, especially the length of those shorts. But around 15 years ago, I started going out any time I could, anywhere I could, and really started to go and set up my own studies and investigations and really explore Australia's frogs a lot more. I was very fortunate under the guidance of Mike, even back when I was an undergraduate student, that I was able to go to places here like the New England Ranges up east of Armidale, and we started doing population studies on things like New England tree frogs, the one up there in the top left corner, the Stuttering Frog, which is one of those giant barred stream frogs, river frogs that lives along the water and lays its nests down in riffle zones of streams. And even doing surveys looking for the extinct peppered frog. And you can see here, I used to get fellow undergraduate students or graduate students to come and volunteer, and we'd go out and we'd do surveys and transects for all these sorts of frogs. I managed to dig up this photo. This here is actually my younger sister, who I even managed to convince at times when I couldn't find enough undergraduate students to come out into the rainy rainforest looking for frogs. Dragged her along at the time. I think she was about 14 or 15. And again, you can tell by the length of those shorts, this is going back some way. As you can tell with some of the scientific equipment we used to use, and I loaded her up with, believe it or not, a Discman. For anyone listening that doesn't know what that is, if you're born this century perhaps, it's a thing that played CDs, and you could play frog calls out over loud hailers and they would actually call back at you, and that's the way we used to go and survey frogs. And yeah, I used to work her through till the wee hours of the morning, sometimes till dawn. It's not just the gastric brooding frog in Australia that has some of probably the world's most fascinating forms of parental care. I've been very fortunate to work on this frog here, the hip pocket frog Acidarlingtoni. We did some studies into their fascinating acoustic communication a few years back, where neighboring males will get into this pattern and battle of trying to synchronize their calls, which is really rare in nature. A form of either cooperation or competition. The jury's a little bit out on that. But they're not just fascinating for their call. This is actually a tiny little species of frog about the size of your thumbnail. And it actually lives in the rainforest leaf litter on the rainforest floor. And the fascinating thing about this frog is here you can see a male and a female get together. Males call, they attract females, the usual sort of story, and the female comes along. But unlike a lot of frogs, this one doesn't lay hundreds or thousands of eggs directly into water. It actually lays a small clump of maybe a dozen, 15 or so eggs, 20 at most, that are really large in size with really large yolk. And it actually just attaches it or buries it down into nests in the leaf litter. So it doesn't occur anywhere near freestanding water. And you can see here that this is a picture of those embryos and eggs developing. They've got a very large yolk, which they're developing off. And the male knows to come back after a couple of weeks, right around the time when these embryos are nearing the stage of hatching. And this here is a picture of a male returning to a clump of eggs in the nest. And the reason they do this is that they know they're about to hatch. You can see here that the tadpoles are now hatching. And the clue is in the name, but the reason these actually do it is because this little frog actually has hip pockets. It has little inguinal pouches, I guess kind of like a kangaroo's pouch, down in the groin region. And that it comes back just as the tadpoles are about to hatch, and the tadpoles will actually wriggle inside those pouches. And you can see that happening here. So this is a really rare form of not only parental care in a frog, which is quite rare, but male parental care. It's the males that come back. And a bit like the gastric brooding frog, that the embryos and tadpoles undergo development, complete metamorphosis inside the stomach. This one does it inside the pouches. And then here is a picture of a little metamorphling. They completely metamorphose inside those pockets. And here is a picture of one emerging. And at this point, these tiny little froglets, they come out about the size of a match head. They are then off on their own into the leaf litter on the rainforest floor. But another incredible example, you can see a little one going up Dad's back onto his head. Another incredible example of parental care in an Australian frog, where there's a real trade-off with investment into actually caring for the young and raising and a lot of tadpoles through to metamorphosis and survival. But rather than just laying lots and lots and lots of eggs and putting energy into that and hoping that a few survive. So it's got an opposite strategy. It lays less eggs, bigger ones with bigger yolk, more quality, and invests in parental care to make sure that clutch makes it through to metamorphosis. Another incredible feat of Australian frogs is the fact that our continent here is the driest on Earth. I think most people here would recognise that. The mesic zones where it's rainy, like along the eastern coast and has seasons, 4 seasons a year for most parts, is actually quite rare. Most of the Australian continent is arid or semi-arid. And in some places out in the middle of Australia, it doesn't rain for years at a time. But Australian frogs have managed to actually adapt to this. And I think one of the greatest examples here is the eastern water frog, Cyclorana platycephala. This is one of the really famous water holding frogs that actually is responsible for the indigenous Dreamtime story of Tiddalik, the water holding frog, if anybody's read that wonderful tale. But this frog effectively comes up when it does rain to the surface, but it obviously dries out after not too long. And so the way that this and other burrowing frogs in Australia manage to survive those long periods without rain is that they're actually able to burrow, and they have incredible physiology. This is one here that's actually been found and dug up during a dry time, like a period of no rain. And they're actually able to store a lot of fat in special organs called fat bodies around their kidneys, so that they've got something to live off. And then they're able to shed layers and layers of skin to form like a waxy cocoon underneath the soil. So that locks all the moisture in and holds their moisture. Then they basically shut their system down almost completely into a state of essentially hibernation and live off those fat reserves. And there's been reports that these particular frogs can do that and live underground for up to 7 years between rainy periods. When the rain comes, it triggers the frog to wake up, come to the surface, eat as much as they can, bonk their brains out, do what frogs do, explosively breed, and just totally build up those fat reserves again, just in time for when it dries out to burrow underneath the ground again, potentially for several years. So really incredible adaptations that have allowed Australia's frogs to survive and thrive right across the continent. And here's some more examples of these beautiful burrowing frogs. They're not just incredible from their sort of evolved features and adaptations, but they're usually quite spectacular too. Here's a few of my favorite examples. The Crucifix Frog, noted in Benetai. This has been likened to a beautiful Aboriginal dot painting. It's just absolutely spectacular. Those beautiful dots of reds and yellows and whites. Just a spectacular frog. Here's another one in the same genus, the desert spadefoot, noted in Nichol's eye, again, just emerging to come up and have a feed. And another one from the same genus. And you can see here, noted in Weigel eye from the Kimberley, yet another one. And these guys, they've got a great defensive posture. You can see here that reminds me of like some sort of creature out of Mario Kart or something, where they try to look really scary. Looks like it's going to shoot like flame balls or something out of its eyes in that picture. But it's not just the burrowing frogs in Australia that are beautiful. We've got lots of little ground toadlets as well. And believe it or not, these ones are all around us. This one here, the red-crowned toadlet, Judeophony Australis, it's actually endemic to the Sydney Basin bioregion. So it's entirely contained to the Hawkesbury sandstone areas in the Sydney Basin. So it's one that you can actually find around the Central Coast as far as it goes up north around the Wadigans, and then the ranges there along the Great Divide and the Hawkesbury Sandstone. And it's a terrestrial breeder as well, constructs little nests right at the headwaters of drainage lines around that sandstone region. It's a vulnerable species, unfortunately, but it is one that you can find around the Ku-ring-gai area for sure. Some of the frogs have their beautiful colours underneath. We're not entirely sure why this is, but it's thought to be potentially a predator response, that you're camouflaged on your back, but you've got to, if you're startled, you might flip over and have these bright warning signals that in nature typically signal danger, don't eat me, I might be toxic or poisonous. Or just to startle a predator potentially and have time to get away. Here's a classic one with one of our geocrinia, the roseate frog. Or how about this spectacular beast? This one comes from the southwest corner of Western Australia, the sunset frog, a genus that my PhD supervisor Mike Marnie was involved in naming, but you can see why it's called the sunset frog. Absolutely spectacular, almost like a lava orange drooling across its face and hands and feet and in the groin and armpits. And it only occurs from a small number of hectares around Walpole in southwest Western Australia. A really remarkable frog, actually breeds in highly acidic peat bogs where almost nothing else could possibly breed. A fascinating frog, but check out its belly. You know, this is incredible. You can see that sort of sunset lava color coming right down its chin where it meets this beautiful sort of slaty gray belly. Just spectacular. And of course, if we're talking about spectacular frogs, it's hard to go past one of the nation's flagship species, unfortunately a flagship threatened species, and one of the most threatened species that's not yet extinct in the wild, the Corroboree frog. It occurs remarkably up on the snow-capped mountains around Mount Kosciuszko. It's the only place it's known from. It actually lives under the snow in winter, so we have species, believe it or not, that can survive on snow-capped mountains. Burrowing down into the peat bog. Again, you can see here it's a terrestrial breeder. It lays smaller numbers of very large yolky eggs that develop a long way further in the development inside the egg, living off the yolk before they hatch, and then they can just swim around in the nests when they fill up with water with rain. But unfortunately, sad to say, again, beautiful belly colors, that there's only about 50 of these left in the wild, and so there's a lot of programs happening at zoos trying to restore this species through captive breeding and disease management. all sorts of beautiful tree frogs. You know, it's not just the eastern dwarf green tree frog or Perrin's tree frog that are often sighted in people's backyards or around the suburbs, but all sorts of spectacular ones. The Blue Mountains tree frog, again, one that's occurs around the Sydney Basin in the mountains around there. One of my favorite. Has a fascinating two-part complex mating call that's really unique. One of our leaf green tree frogs, and we have a few different species of those. Again, you can find those around Sydney. There's a tree frog down in Tasmania that only occurs down there, Latoria burrowsii, the Tasmanian tree frog, completely endemic to Tasmania. And one of the largest, if not the largest, we think it might be the largest in terms of overall body mass, tree frog in the world, right here in Australia, the magnificent tree frog that occurs up in the Kimberley region and actually occupies the sandstone gorges and lives up giant gorges, not in trees, as you might guess. Just to give it a bit of scale and show you how big it is, I've been very fortunate enough to have worked for many years, over a decade, up in the Kimberley region studying this species. We were a little bit worried about it as the cane toads march towards its habitat. It's the only place on Earth it occurs, but an absolutely spectacular species. And here's a few more photographs of us back in the day in action working with it. And that actually does have some relevance to the story behind the book, which I'll get back to shortly. But I can't get there before, of course, I talk about Australia's poster child frog, probably the sexiest frog in all of Australia, hands down. The turtle frog, Mitochondrial Dna. If this doesn't get you excited about Australia's frogs, I'm not sure what will. Here's some more pictures. The reason it looks a little bit like a shellless turtle is because this species, which is endemic entirely to the southwest corner of Western Australia, actually spends most of its life deep underground, about a metre or so underground. It comes up occasionally to the surface to eat, to get insects and to call and attract a mate. But even when it attracts a mate, then it will pair up with a female and go back underground to where its nest is, like I said, up to around a metre underground. It reproduces underground and lays eggs where the tadpole actually develops entirely within the egg, and then metamorphoses inside the egg and hatches as a fully formed frog. And the reason it has this incredible morphology and is such a great looking frog is because of that morphology needed to burrow underground. And of all the burrowing frogs in Australia, this is one of only 3 species that burrows head first. So you can see it's got those really thick arms and big, thick fingers that it can use for burrowing head first down into the sand. Just spectacular. And it's not always the external morphology that's really fascinating about some of Australia's frogs. Here, this one might look like just another somewhat ordinary brown frog. Not there's such a thing as an ordinary frog, they're all fantastic. The tusk frog, Adelotus brevis. But where a frog like this gets really interesting is if you actually look inside its mouth. It's called the tusk frogs because it actually, the males in particular, females have them, but they're more rudimentary. But the males have these rather giant tusks, very hard tusks that protrude from the lower jaw. And it's a fascinating case. It was sort of not totally resolved why they have these, but it's thought it's probably a case of sexual selection. So think of things like elephants, where the males have these big tusks for fighting each other, or deer with their antlers, again, for fighting each other over mates. So that's what's known as sexual selection, where there's a particular selection happening for one of the sexes. For things like male competition. And we believe that's what's happening here too with the tusk frog. So it's got these tusks probably for wrestling and fighting other males. Other frogs, such as another one of the southwest Western Australian burrowing frogs, this one's known as the hooting frog, very giant one. You can see again his big giant arms. This one, he's turned his nuptial pads, the pads that males often have on the inside of their first finger for clasping onto females when they reproduce, into full nuptial spines. You can see these are really huge. They're very callous and sharp. And again, almost certainly they're using these for wrestling each other. So another case of arsenal in frogs. So hopefully I've inspired you in that sort of introductory part about why frogs in Australia are actually so much more than little green jobs or little brown jobs that people often encounter in their backyard gardens or anything like that. But one thing I also learned early on when I was going down my journey of becoming a frog biologist and studying frogs and learning lots about frogs was that not all Australian frogs are these big, spectacular, beautiful, colourful frogs, or with giant tusks or some other, sort of interesting morphological feature. But we actually have a whole bunch of these little brown jobs as well. This here is just a few examples of species from one genus called Crinia, often known as sign-bearing frogs. And as you can see, they're really small. They're only about the size of anything from about your pinky fingernail up to about your index fingernail, tend to be really small. And they're tiny little brown frogs. And I don't know about you, but just looking at these can be quite difficult to tell apart. And it's not the only genus like this in Australia. Here's another one known as a group of toadlets, known by the genus Euparolea. And again, you can see that there's 4 different species here, but, how do you tell these apart? They look quite similar, right? Small brown frogs, all about the same size and morphologically very similar. And in fact, as Karen said early on and in the introduction, I was very fortunate enough myself. This is a genus that's very near and dear to my heart that I actually discovered a new species, and we described this in 2016. But another of these small brown Euparolea toadlets. This one actually named after Mike Marnie, my PhD supervisor, has quite a spectacular belly if you flip it over, and to me looks sort of really different to the other toadlets in the area, but to a lot of people, they just can't tell these things apart. So when I was learning about frogs, of course, I went out and bought the field guides that were available at the time, many of them quite old, have sort of written in between about the 1970s and 1990s and out of print for a long time. And I remember traveling across the top end of Australia and, catching frogs all over the place. And I would often turn up little brown frogs like this and pull out my field guide and try and identify them. You can see here's an example of floodplain toadlet, Euparolea inundata from up in the Northern Territory. And I remember finding frogs like this and looking at my book, and you can see here I've just highlighted what the old guides used to tell me a little bit about its vertebrate call and similar species. It resembles Euparolea arenicola, from which it is most readily distinguished by its size as well as slightly different advertisement call. Okay, well, here's a picture of that frog, Euparolea arenicola, and I don't know about you, but to me these 2 small brown frogs look quite similar. And just by size alone, it's really hard, because how do you know you don't just have a small one? And besides, they're all only quite small, about 15 millimeters to 20 millimeters long. And the other problem I realized at the time that, yes, it overlapped with Euparolea arenicola, but also with Euparolea aspera, Euparolea borealis, stridera, talpa, daviesii, lithomoda, and 7 other species in this genus of Euparolea, of this small brown frog, and just provided with no way to tell them apart. And I just remember thinking, man, how does anyone do this? How do we identify when you find a small brown frog like this in the wild? And it's nobody's fault. Back then it was really hard to tell these apart, and nobody knew a lot of the key features. It just hadn't really been worked out before in complex detail. And I remember always wishing that I had a field guide that would be able to help with this sort of thing and really be able to pick up a frog, look at its features and identify it. Well, a few years after this, and this is the relevant part about working in the Kimberley, I was working up there on the magnificent tree frog that we saw earlier, on an Australian geographic expedition, and bumped into this guy here, Mike Swan, who was a herpetologist and zookeeper that worked down at Healesville Sanctuary for many years as head zookeeper. And he was up there helping us with some of our research. I do work on other things as well. We're studying turtles and snakes and things and crocodiles, and he was up helping with a lot of that. And Mike has always had a real passion as well for frogs and spent most of his life photographing them. He's a very avid herpetologist, so he sent me these photographs. I don't think he's ever gone a day in his life without being very interested in reptiles and amphibians, and has always been around them his whole life, an incredible fascination with the natural world, including photography. And as Mike tells me, he doesn't go anywhere without a trusty snake hook, for example. And chatting to Mike and being such an avid photographer, which I'm not, I'm just more fascinated with working on the animals, and I'm not a particularly good photographer. We got chatting about the problem that there just wasn't a field guide available at the time that really helped identify clearly all the Australian frogs. And we both agreed that there was a real need for one. And that set us off on this journey where we decided, well, I think it's time to write the book I wish that I'd always had as a young field biologist. And I love this photograph because this is actually from that trip. This is Mike and I going out to, I think it was Mulgu Billabong, up in very far north, East Kimberley, to search for a frog that I'd never seen and that Mike had never seen and we'd never photographed, which was a frog kind of similar to a spotted grass frog, but it only occurs up there in a very small patch around Kununurra, called the flat-headed frog, Limnodonastes depressus. And believe it or not, this photo here that I've just put up actually made its way into the book for that species and was actually the very moment here where we were photographing it. That's the photo that was produced from that. So that really, just to me, it was a fantastic photo and really kicked off our journey. But it was hard yakka because that billabong was full of 4 and 5 meter saltwater crocodiles. So while we were working on catching these frogs and taking the photographs, we had to have someone carefully standing by, making sure that the crocs weren't ready to catch us. And so that's how the book was born, and very pleased to say 6 years after we set out on that journey. Foolish me thought it would only take a couple of years. I thought I knew lots about frogs. It turned out I had to spend many years looking at many hundreds of specimens to work little brown jobs to work them all out, and do lots and lots of reading. So 6 years later, in 2018, we finally had a complete guide to frogs of Australia published. And just to highlight a few things that I'm really proud about this book. So coming back to that example I gave with Euparolea inundata, the floodplain toadlet over here, we've introduced a few, I think, innovative features to really help people rapidly identify their species. So for example, when we describe the species, we've actually bolded characters that are key diagnostic characters. So there are lots of characters when you describe a frog that are shared similarly, say, between little brown frogs. But if they're important, they're bolded. And importantly, spent many years working out that for the similar species section that we could actually list every frog that species might co-occur with or be mistaken for, and actually specifically detail how you could diagnostically tell them apart, if at all possible. And so, for example, here, we actually went to all that trouble to say, well, for inundata, which overlaps with 14 other congeneric species in that genus, here is how to tell them apart from every single one of those. So that's really sort of the story and the journey, I think, behind the frog. But just to finish this talk over the next 5 or 10 minutes before I'll open up to some questions, it's important, perhaps unfortunately, but to recognise one more thing about Australia's and indeed the world's frogs. Now, I talked and introduced this talk and journey tonight with the discovery of the gastric brooding frog, discovered there in the early 1970s. But what I didn't tell you at that time, because I wanted you to really enjoy Australia's amazing frogs, is that unfortunately, by 1981, this species had actually gone extinct. We are talking about one of the world's most remarkable, evolved reproductive modes of any animal class anywhere on Earth gone. I am thankful to be able to say a few years later, again, coming back to my PhD supervisor, Mike Marnie, he actually did discover a second species of gastric brooding frog up in the Yungala Ranges in North Queensland when he went out looking. And this was a great relief at the time, as you can imagine, because we thought, thank God, we haven't lost just one of life's most miraculous, evolved reproductive adaptations. But unfortunately, a few years later, after it was discovered, it too was extinct. And I'm really sad to share with you tonight, but it is an important lesson, that both gastric brooding frog species have gone extinct and have never been found again. And so we've lost one of nature's most remarkable frogs, I think, anywhere on Earth. And that really sent a warning signal at the time to the few people that did care about frogs and studied frogs back in the 70s and the 80s. If it wasn't such an incredible frog that was discovered, I don't even know if people would have realized at the time that our frogs were disappearing. And so when scientists thought, oh, we should probably go out and have a look around the rainforests in Queensland and see what's happening. Has anybody checked up on any of our native frogs? They're just always there. No one really cared too much. And when they went and looked, scientists actually found that a whole swath of rainforest frogs in Queensland could actually no longer be found. So in Australian rainforest streams, the frogs were disappearing or had disappeared overnight without people even realizing, but the habitat remained. And this was known as sort of enigmatic decline. It was very puzzling at the time and took a long time to work out. And it wasn't until the 1990s, about 1996, that it was actually a paper was published by Lee Berger here in the upper right corner from James Cook University. She did her PhD on this and actually identified that this was really the start of what a lot of you are probably now aware of, but the amphibian chytrid fungus pandemic. This is a fungal disease, an invasive disease that's spread around the world. We know now that it's come out of South Korea or somewhere around that region and spread around the world in the 1960s and 1970s. And it's caused devastating loss and decline of amphibian biodiversity all over the world, and certainly in Australia as well. It's what's causing the Corroboree frog to decline dramatically, and only around 50 individuals left. Other species that used to be all up and down the east coast, like the green and golden bell frog, which is this frog that's pictured here, that's just succumbed to the disease. And it's a tiny microscopic fungus that actually infects keratinized tissue, and unfortunately, frogs have keratin in their skin. So keratin is a structural protein that's in your fingernails, it's in your hair, and it's in frog skin. And we now know that the zoospores, they're microscopic aquatic zoospore that the fungus releases, and they can swim around in the environment. They get into the skin and basically disrupt electrolyte transport in the cells and effectively give frogs a heart attack. And so you're probably aware about this because there's been a lot of frogs dying over the wet and cold winter we've had that we think is most likely linked to a wet and cold winter, which favours the chytrid pathogen. And so you can see this in real time. Every winter we get these die-offs, and it's an extraordinarily distressing and sad event. And this is a paper that I published a few years ago with colleagues like Deb Bauer, who led the paper, but just to highlight how much we think, we're all aware now of global pandemics with COVID, but this is really the first one we've seen in modern time that's wiped out entire species. And you can see here that it's swept all across the world. And we actually now know that it's responsible for at least 501 species to have dramatically declined or gone extinct in just the past few decades due to this disease. And it's been a major contributor of the fact that, unfortunately, around half of the planet's 8,000 odd amphibian species are now at immediate risk of decline and extinction. And that story, not a lot of people realise, started right here in Australia, and it was an Australian who actually discovered the disease. But just to take one more slightly dramatic turn and hopefully pick up the mood just a little bit, because I like to be a conservation optimist, being a conservation ecologist. And to bring the story of the gastric brooding frog home full circle, here is actually a picture of a gastric brooding frog carcass on the left. And just to reiterate what species it is, the picture on the right from back when they were alive, it was actually found in the chest freezer of Mike Tyler, the professor I told you about in the story at the beginning of the presentation. And when he was clearing out his lab some years ago now, in the early 2010s, he actually discovered a couple of carcasses of old gastric brooding frogs that back in the 1970s, before they went extinct, had died for whatever reason or been dissected and were put in the freezer. And remarkably, that freezer hadn't switched off. Now, at the time, we were reading all sorts of papers about sort of modern cloning techniques and the way that reproductive physiologists and biologists had actually started to clone things like sheep that they were cloning from live cells, from frozen cells frozen away. And we thought, having an interest in reproductive biology for conservation, so things like biobanks, animal seed banks, we wondered if it was possible to maybe actually try and isolate some nuclei out of these frozen specimens and see if we could actually potentially bring back some gastric brooding frog embryos. So, like all good scientific endeavors, of course, the inaugural meeting always kicks off at the pub. That's where the best ideas come from. And Mike Archer, a professor at University of New South Wales, had this coined this great phrase of the Lazarus Project leaping towards extinction. Very dramatic, and you have to have some backing behind you like that and some excitement around the project. But here are some pictures of us actually in the lab. The idea here is that you can actually potentially take a nucleus out of one species and put it into a donor egg. So exactly the sort of way that they cloned Dolly the sheep as the first cloned mammal, these sorts of technologies potentially can work. So here you can see hard at work with a donor frog's egg, a closely related species, one of the mixophies. But it turned out it's quite challenging. We have to actually remove layers of jelly. So frog eggs have these thick layers of jelly to protect them around. You've got to remove a lot of those manually in order to be able to actually inject isolated nuclei, which we managed to isolate out of brain cells from the dead carcass. And we reported this back in 2013, but so some of you may have read the news at the time, but we were actually able, remarkably, to get some embryos developing. You can see here, this is what they looked like. Early on, you saw first cleavage, and then they dividing into 2 cells, and then they cleaved again, divided into 4. And we managed to get embryos that went all the way up to sort of what we call early blastulae, so a few thousand cells, and they were not entirely normal, slightly abnormal, but we were able to show genetically that it was actually gastric brooding frog DNA that had been reactivated and brought alive and was dividing in cells. Unfortunately, probably just a technical block about their incredible, remarkable reproductive physiology, but the embryos did stop developing at that early embryonic stage. But we actually think this might be possible. And so, yeah, this caught a lot of media attention at the time, lots of interesting headlines, likening it to things like Jurassic Park, which of course it's not, because DNA can't last more than about 100,000 years, but it does put potential hope and promise on the horizon. And the reason I brought this up is that's as far as we got, and of course we don't have the gastric brooding frog now. But being a conservation optimist, I think it's really important to be optimistic and to really work on possible solutions. We don't want to have to resort to de-extinction and bringing back species through cloning. A lot of the work I do is about mitigating threatening processes that are happening in the environment. We work on things like environmental refugia to provide refugia away from the disease in real habitats, so we stop any more frogs actually declining or going extinct in the first place. But just to leave this imparting message really to all of you, because at the end of the day, you don't need to be a conservation scientist, trying to work on advanced techniques to have to unfortunately resort to do things like bring back extinct species. We don't want them to go extinct or decline in the first place. And just really an imparting message that hopefully I've inspired you that the world of frogs, well, indeed all animals, but I'm heavily biased towards frogs. In the world of frogs, the Australian frogs are just the most incredible fauna and really worth protecting and harboring. And at the end of the day, conservation scientists can only do so much, and it's really up to you, to all of us, to protect habitat, to get involved, to let us know what's going on with frogs, to volunteer. Here are some pictures from expeditions we've done. I used to do these with Mike all the time. On Earthwatch trips, we get community participations, lots of citizens coming out, getting engaged. There are things like the Australian Museum Frog ID app that you can record calls, you can take note, you can care, you can get engaged in your local community, be aware of developments that are happening if they're going to impact on sensitive frog habitat. But it's all of our planet, and you guys really are Earth's future ambassadors, particularly any young members amongst us watching tonight. And I'll leave it there so there's a little bit of time for questions, but just to acknowledge again the fact that most of those photographs were not mine, and the list of photographers are down the bottom. And also just to let you guys know, there's my email. I'm contactable anytime, and I mentioned this to Jacob and Karen earlier, but as an author, I'm actually able to provide copies at a 10% discount if anybody's interested in the book. And I'm more than happy to sign those and autograph them. So if you are interested in the book and would like one at a bit of a discount, please feel free to jot down my email and just reach out and I can arrange that. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully I've inspired you to take a bit more of an interest in frogs around you and convince you that frogs are more than just little green or little brown frogs that you commonly encounter in backyard ponds.
Yeah, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Just those beautiful pictures, so much information. I think we really learnt a lot. We do have a couple of questions waiting. So Elva has asked if you could tell her about what frog you discovered at Newcastle Airport.
Sure. Well, you were lucky that one actually got flashed up in the presentation, but it was actually one of those what we refer to lovingly as little brown jobs of the toadlet genus Euparolea. It's only about 2 centimeters long. I think they're spectacular and beautiful. Some people think they're a little bit ordinary. But yeah, that was the species, and it was a really incredible moment in my career, because it wasn't a species we sort of discovered through running the genes. Sometimes scientists look at the genes and realize there's what's known as a cryptic species hidden away that looks like a lot of other species that we didn't realize about. We only know about the genes. For me, seeing this frog, straight away, it was obvious, and it looked like, just a totally new frog. So it was very, very exciting, and it is one. Unfortunately, almost straight away went to endangered species listing because it is quite range restricted. It's only known from about Seal Rocks up in the Mile Lakes in the north down to the Central Coast, and it occurs along a very thin coastal strip of sandbed habitat along that coastal heath in very small patches. So it's actually one that we're working with New South Wales DPIE right now to try and study its ecology, work out all the knowledge gaps. DPIE have been incredibly supportive, very proactive in its management, and we're hoping to prevent it from, declining and getting any worse.
Yeah, I just actually had a question about that. So I know you went over how the fungus epidemic was sort of impacting the populations of the frogs. Are there any other sort of external pressures that are sort of, really impacting those populations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing we can never escape, I think, for most species is the threat and impact of habitat loss and fragmentation. I think it's an interesting world we live in now, and I think one of the realities we really need to front up to, and I often, when I give lectures, teach my students this, there's no doubt that is a pervasive threat And for some species, probably actually Marnie's total, perhaps it's actually one of the largest threats because we don't think that one might be impacted by chytrid. So it might be one of the rare ones that's not, and more impacted by the fact it lives along a thin coastal strip of Eastern Australia where everyone wants to live and build suburbs and mine sand. So certainly all those traditional sorts of impacts definitely have a lot of impact, and invasive species. Climate change is a huge one for frogs now. Especially mountain top endemics, ones that live above the snow line, like the Corroboree frog. The snow's disappearing. Where are they going to go? There's nowhere further up the mountain they can go. So I guess, traditionally, if you read any conservation textbook, it always talks about habitat loss as the threat in the world. And there's no doubt it's a big one. If we don't protect habitat, there's nothing to restore species to, and we're going to lose them. But the hard reality now of the 21st century are all these new sort of what I call 21st century threats, things like emerging infectious diseases like chytrid that spreads the world and pays no attention whatsoever to national park borders or boundaries. The Conondale Ranges were made into a national park where the Gastric Brooding Frog was, and the Youngalla Ranges are a national park too, and they're pristine apart from the fact they've got this invasive fungus. So we've had species that disappear. A lot of the Amazon basin rainforest species are disappearing in untouched virgin rainforest. And so threats like emerging diseases, invasive species, think about cane toads hopping across Australia. They're hopping across the Kimberley right now, which is one of, a true wilderness, so much habitat. It's not a habitat problem, it's an invasive species problem. And climate change, you could turn the whole of the Great Barrier Reef into a national park. Overnight, it's not going to do anything to help from climate change and coral bleaching, wiping out tons of biodiversity. So we're in this unfortunate situation now. We've got to face the fact that there's all these other sort of modern threats caused by humans that we need to really address and come up with new techniques and mitigation strategies. And so that's a lot what I work on. So that's the doom and the gloom part of it, I guess. But again, I'm a real conservation optimist, and I don't have time tonight, but could talk about a lot of exciting strategies. And I always think, look, we're achieving a lot as well as a lot of problems.
Yeah, fantastic. So quite a few questions have come through about frog calling and where people can go to sort of get recordings of frog sounds. Do you have any recommendations about that?
Yeah, so the wonderful thing about the modern age of internet is that actually there's incredible resources around now. Some of the museums in Australia have developed and produced wonderful banks of frog calls. The Western Australian Museum, for all the Western Australian species, if you go to the museum website, I think they've got call recordings for all species in Western Australia. The Australian Museum, of course, has the very famous Frog ID app. So you can actually download this app. If you hear a frog out in the environment, you can actually hit a button, hold your phone up, it'll record a little segment of it, and it sends it to the museum, and they'll actually identify that call and tell you what it is, and it goes into an important database. And I think on that app too, they've got examples of recordings for a lot of species. So there's quite a lot of resources out there, especially run by the museums, that are fantastic. I guess the thing with frog identification in general, though, is that firstly, it's only the males that call of any species. Females don't call. So if you ever catch a female, obviously they don't call. And then, of course, the males only call at certain times of the year in the breeding season, and then on certain times when the conditions are right to call for a female. So I think it's really good to have other resources, books, and access to ways to tell frogs apart. Because if you ever go out looking for frogs, a lot of the ones you catch, they're not calling, and you don't have access to those data and ways of IDing frogs. So, but yeah, fantastic resources are available now.
Yeah, great. So Mark has just asked, it's a bit of a long one, but hi Simon, I'm working on prescribed burns, always worried about red-crowned toadlets in the leaf litter at heads of creeks. Do you know of any strategies that can assist to prevent population loss in our burn areas, hard as they are leaf litter dwellers in the sandstone?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is Australian fauna has co-evolved with fire for millennia, and they're really good at it. So fires sweep through naturally, and species don't go extinct. So I think with things like red-crowned toadlets and most of those Judeophony toadlets in that genus, they're really good at getting down into the moist soil and into their nests when fires come over. I think they probably sense smoke coming and are good at that. The real problem, I think, with fire is the intensity of fires. And I think that's becoming the problem. We all know about the very incredibly bad fires we had just before the COVID pandemic hit. And those are the problems with a drying and warming climate. There's more fuel load, the fires are more frequent, more intense, and that's what our fauna has not co-evolved to handle. I think they can handle low intensity fires. They know what to do. They know how to escape. So I think low intensity fires, for management are probably not any great issue. It's really the problem is with climate change and there's the intensity and frequency of fires that might impact frogs. We have done a little bit of work about the bushfire impacts of that, particularly the black summer. And there are quite a few species surprisingly did okay and have bounced back not too bad, and others potentially not as well. So we know the really intense fires are probably the problem.
Okay. Bruce has just asked, is there a difference between the Queensland gastric brooding frog and the southern gastric brooding frog?
They're both in Queensland, but yeah, there's two species. A northern, we commonly refer to them as the northern and southern. So the southern was the first one that was found around the Cottontail Ranges. Its scientific name is Rehobotrachus, and the northern one is further north in around the Yungala region, Yungala Ranges, Finch Hatton Gorge, and it's known commonly as the northern gastric brooding frog, and its scientific name is Rehobotrachus vitellinus. So yeah, there are two species. Well, there were two species, now both well and truly presumed extinct, unfortunately.
I actually had a question that I was a bit curious about. When you were discussing how one certain frog species had that parental care strategy and the rest usually tend to sort of have that just lay as many eggs as possible strategy. Is there any kind of, do we know if there's any kind of reason as to why that frog has evolved that way and others have sort of taken the just lay as many eggs strategy? Do we know why? Or
wow, you are asking some incredibly in-depth, profound questions in evolutionary ecology. What triggers the evolution of one particular strategy over another? Look, it probably remains a question largely unanswered. There's probably individual systems and species where people might be able to identify the environmental factors that have led to one system evolving over another. The thing about evolution is it just has to be good enough, and sometimes it's possible that there could be several strategies for being successful, and one's been favored because it's worked for some individuals, and then the genes that underlie those behaviors and physiology persist. That's how evolution works. But typically, I think we just see a broad range of strategies in nature, because if everything did the same thing, then they'd all be competing for the same sorts of resources. But in general, things like terrestrial breeders have probably evolved in times where freestanding water has not been as available, or perhaps there's predators in freestanding water that means a lot of the offspring get eaten. And so there could be all sorts of factors for why things like what we call direct development, where they don't need to have a free swimming tadpole phase or even necessarily hatch out of the egg, evolve. And then, parental care. It's just a real trade-off. You can go, evolution can probably push you in two directions: to put all your energy and investment into producing lots and lots and lots of eggs and offspring, and just put as many as you can out, knowing that a lot won't survive because you're not investing in large yolk supplies or looking after your offspring, but you're producing a lot of them, so you just need some to survive. The other way is the way I guess humans have gone. We have a very small number of offspring, but we invest incredible amounts of energy and time to ensure really high chance of survival of those few. Both avenues end up with the same result. You can put all your energy into producing lots and you only need a few to survive, or produce just a few and ensure most of them survive, as long as you get the few to survive to replace the two parents. But it's a great and deep question. And
it's
probably
very Fascinating.
things.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just cautious of the time. I think we've got 2 more questions and then we might need to wrap up. So someone's asked, are medications and antibiotics that are discarded and leached into water systems causing any issues for our frogs as they are for aquatic insects?
Yes, there has been research into that, particularly in the United States. But there's some famous examples of things like pesticides and things like that having significant effects on frogs. And I think now there has been some research to suggest that, hormones and things related to the female pill and stuff like that in the water can indeed be taken up by frogs, because frogs have this incredible moist skin where they use it for respiration as well as moisture uptake. So they can take up moisture through their skin. They don't drink like we do, and they can breathe through it. And so because the skin's so permeable, they also can take things in the environment up into their skin too. And so, yes, anything we put out into the environment like that can certainly have an effect. And pharmaceuticals, I think, have been shown to bioaccumulate in amphibians and can have effects for sure.
Interesting. So just wrap up with one last question. So Paris's has asked, with the cane toad problem, has there been any thoughts about introducing the fungus to cane toads, or have they completely evolved to resist any kind of fungus?
Yeah, that's a good question. Something we've thought about. Funnily enough, in the laboratory, if you expose young cane toads to the chytrid fungus, the invasive fungus that's killing everything, they can be a little bit susceptible. Unfortunately, the problem with the cane toad, it's probably twofold. Firstly, they've got that really thick, leathery skin that we associate with true toads like cane toads. That probably does offer some protection. But the other thing is that they're predominantly a tropical species because they've come from Central and South America in the tropics, and they are slowly marching down the coast of New South Wales, quite slowly, but they tend to like those tropical climates and temperatures. So they've really spread across the top end of Australia. And up there, it's actually warmer than the chytrid fungal pathogen likes. It's actually a fragile fungus to temperature. So anything over about 27 degrees tends to actually interfere with the pathogen, and frogs can clear it and really disrupts its cycle, so for transmitting infection and developing disease. So cane toads are probably out in dry, warmer environments that don't favor chytrid. So unfortunately, it would be fantastic if one invasive actually did us a favor and knocked off another invasive, but it hasn't worked out that way, unfortunately.
Awesome stuff. I might just ask one last one that just came through that looks quite interesting. With developing the embryos, how were you able to establish that the embryos developed were actually gastric brooding frogs and not the host egg's embryo?
Yeah, great question. So firstly, with the host egg, we actually knock out the nucleus. So we actually have to remove the female, what's called the pronucleus, out of the egg, and so that when we put the gastric brooding frog nucleus in, that's the only nucleus that's in there. But it does get a little bit more complicated than that, because gametes are sperm and eggs, eggs specifically, also have what's known as mitochondrial DNA. It's down the female line, and theoretically we think we knock most of it out, but to answer your question, we use genetic tools to identify that it's the gastric brooding frog DNA and nucleus that's developing, and we can do that in quantitative methods to show how much of it is the gastric brooding frog. And in the nucleus, it was overwhelmingly the gastric brooding frog, but you can get bits of the mitochondrial DNA in there as well. But we just use sort of fairly advanced genetic techniques. So we can just use DNA sequencing and genetic techniques to say which species it was.
And do you know if there's any significant further progress with actually cloning them successfully?
So I can say that it is something it's been a few years where we've had to put it a bit on hiatus with COVID and just with timing, with getting other frogs and stuff like that. But I can say it is something we are planning to continue and see if we can get past that technical block in the not too distant future. Yep.
Yeah, exciting stuff. Okay, so we might just have to wrap up because we're just 10 past now. Thank you so much, Simon, for running us through that really, really beautiful presentation. Very visually stunning, as I said earlier. And I really hope everyone who attended got a lot out of it. I will be announcing the winner of the book over email, so just keep your eyes peeled. We've got a signed copy to give out to one lucky attendee. And yeah, thank you so much, guys. Enjoy your evening. And thank you, Simon.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming along and listening.
All right, take care, everyone. See you.